All right, coming at you all the way live from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. This is Soundwaves, and today I have on co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror, Mr. Danny Haiphong. Good morning, Mr. Haiphong. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm doing all right.
And as we speak, it is really morning. It is 9 Danny's time and 6 o'clock my time. So let's probably just get right into it. Your book, and I first saw your book on Chris Hedges' show on Contact. The interview you did on there. And I definitely raced to go get more information about it and find every interview about you. And you expose the myth of American exceptionalism, the lie of meritocracy. When did you start writing this?
The book?
Mm-hmm.
So I believe the book began in the summer of 2017 was when Roberto and I had our first correspondence about his idea to make a kind of book of essays about this topic, and then it generated into a full-fledged book over the course of our conversations. So I would say the year 2017, summer into the fall, was when we really began to write it.
Mm-hmm. And what was the impetus to expose American exceptionalism, or the lie of American exceptionalism? Was it just a frustration with mainstream media?
That's definitely a huge part of it. I think another reason was because there was actually a lot of movement happening, a lot of incipient kind of resistance that had happened over the last, 5 to 6 years or so, beginning with Occupy Wall Street and the uprising in Ferguson that led to the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the Sanders phenomenon. All of those things really challenged the American exceptionalist narrative and also forced the powers that be to continuously utilize that narrative in service of their own ends. And it became very clear with the advent of Russiagate, for example, in 2016, the way that Bernie Sanders in 2016 was so heavily repressed by the Democratic Party, and also the ways in which that both Occupy and the Black Lives Matter movement during those periods of 2011, 2014 were both repressed and then, outright infiltrated, and how American exceptionalism, this ideology, played a huge role in steering those movements toward more acceptable places. It was clear that a conversation about this ideology had to happen at some point. I mean, we had also come off of 8 years of the Obama administration, where it seemed like the Democratic Party had made a full transition into the party of American exceptionalism. And at the same time that it embraced this ideology full-fledged, it also demonstrated that it didn't have anything to offer to ordinary people, to working people, especially Black people. And that contradiction we felt needed to be highlighted because it demonstrates the conservatization of politics in the United States, the right-wing lurch of politics in the United States, and it's also a very effective ideology. It's very subtle, it's very insidious, and there are so many manifestations of it that I think even well-meaning activists, organizers may not recognize right away. And I think that is the reason why we wanted to engage in these conversations. We had both been involved in our own ways, Roberto in academia, myself in activism, in independent journalism, in approaching these debates and getting, entangled in these debates about World War II, about Colin Kapernick, about Black Lives Matter, about Bernie Sanders, about Donald Trump. All of these debates had this overarching theme of American exceptionalism acting as kind of a buffer between the ruling class and those that the ruling class exploits and oppresses on a day-to-day basis.
In regards to Colin Kaepernick, who is getting a lot of attention, the journey of Kaepernick has changed quite a bit since you wrote this book, as now he's being looked at. What is the NFL's commissioner's name? I can't think of his name off the top of my head. Wrote that apology.
Roger Goodell.
Roger Goodell wrote the kind of sort of apology to Kaepernick, and now people are talking about actually having him on their team. And I've always thought it was interesting to see the way the NFL handled the kneeling, which to me was pretty benign. Because especially if you take into consideration that Kaepernick had talked to a Green Beret and had a meeting with him about what he could do that wouldn't really piss people off, just because all he did was sit down during the national anthem. And then you look at the way the NBA is allowed to do a little bit more, wear the shirts that say "I can't breathe," turn their jerseys inside out when they find out that their owner is a horrible racist. Are the powers that be really good at kind of taking the teeth out of a lot of these movements and making it more about show than about actual substance?
That's always the attempt. When it comes to Colin Kaepernick, if we remember in 2016, after he first engaged in his sit out of the national anthem, we analyzed in our book how the anger wasn't really directed at his stand against police brutality. That was part of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it really was the target that he chose, the national anthem, which not only represents this mythical idea that the police protect and serve for the so-called patriotic good of the nation, but also represents the full representation of the state, its military, its elected officials, and its police as exceptional to all others. So it has an international significance and an imperial significance that Colin Kaepernick, I do believe, understood that and wasn't necessarily trying to challenge, let's say, the military industrial complex, but in choosing his target, he inadvertently did. And that was what engendered his complete repression, because if he had done, let's say, what the NBA players did, as you said, if he had chosen a more benign target, a more indirect target, he likely would have at least been able to play in the NFL. And so we talk a lot about sports as so important to this American exceptionalist myth, because almost like gladiator games, sports really represent the performative aspect of this ideology, in that there is this show that's put on for especially white American audiences to continuously act upon their loyalty to the U.S. state. And that's done through flyovers, that's done through the continuous singing of the national anthem, and that's also done in the ways in which that the military is celebrated over and over and over and over again, especially in NFL, which happens to have a very particular history and relationship to this so-called patriotic ideal. So, Kaepernick, he, over the course of the years since and especially in the last year since our book was released, has been engaged in this struggle with the NFL, where he has been blackballed, he has been repressed, he has been basically eliminated from the NFL, and his career has been basically squashed. But now that there is an interest by the ruling class in trying to sanitize this latest uprising that began on Memorial Day after George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police, Colin Kaepernick has now become one of the ways in which the NFL is trying to clean up its public relations image through acknowledging its quote unquote mistakes. And this is part of American exceptionalism too. It's this idea that the United States and all of its institutions have the capacity to improve, to reform itself, and to become more progressive over the course of history. And this con game that the U.S. imperial state has been playing is now being demonstrated by the NFL, where even though Colin Kaepernick is now being acknowledged as correct and the NFL is trying to acknowledge its so-called racial sins, it also isn't really stepping up to the plate and actually, giving Colin Kaepernick his job back. And even if it did, the crime still stands, right? The crime of repressing an NFL player, blackballing him for the simple reason of standing up against racialized, racist policing is in and of itself indicative of what the NFL and all of its corporate sponsors really believe and what they represent. So this is an attempt by the NFL to try to stop that kind of conversation from happening, to try to keep its fan base, especially its black fan base, from just fleeing the coop. And because I think a big part of the push to get Colin Kaepernick back into the NFL has been certain people like Sean King and others trying to boycott the NFL. So there is this struggle going on, and it's very important. But for us in our book, the reason why we wrote about Colin Kaepernick was also because his struggle really did represent the ways in which the ruling class, the powers that be, attempt to sanitize movements by changing their overall message. If we remember in 2016, this stand against racist policing, once Colin Kaepernick was basically repressed and suppressed and was out of the at least mainstream conversation, it started to become more a conversation about Trump and about uniting the nation, coming together, standing against Trump's vitriol, where he called Colin Kaepernick a son of a bee, right?
Yeah,
and we felt this was important to counter because these NFL owners who still have the Washington Redskins name as one of the teams, who still
the Chiefs,
exactly, the Chiefs, who still continue to celebrate the military, which has killed millions abroad and is itself a racist institution, that this can't be allowed to stand. So a lot of our book is taking these moments and analyzing them in a way that counters the more liberal machinations of this ideology, because at the end of the day, when Trump is calling Kaepernick a son of a bee, it's much easier to come out against that. That's very visible, that's seen, that's very visceral in the gut. But when it comes
to Tom Brady kneeled.
Exactly. But the opportunism, that's harder to recognize.
Yeah, it's always interesting the way I see the NBA and the NFL work, because I felt like the NBA has always allowed their black players to have their moment, but never really do anything. Like, I don't know if you remember Daniel Sterling when he was the owner of the Clippers.
Yep, I remember this.
And then there was the whole thing where he had the conversation and he was calling, what did he call Magic Johnson, the N-word? Or
I think so. I don't remember the detail. I know there's a documentary coming out on ESPN about it, I believe.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
I do believe that's either come out. I don't know. I don't watch too much television, but yeah. Donald Sterling said some racist things, I think was the
players, and the players just turn their jerseys inside out. Mm-hmm. And I always was like, man, had they not played, that would have been the real show of some sort of solidarity and power. Flipping the jerseys inside out to me was kind of like almost giving up. How do you feel about stuff like that?
Well, it's interesting because the NBA, I think you're totally right. There is more of an organized impetus to address these issues. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the NBA has this long history of, especially over the last few decades, of having a mainly black labor force, but at the same time having a very white management force. And that contradiction, I think, has led to a lot of resentments. And I think that's part of the reason why there has been this push, not to mention the economic aspect of it, but there's also been a political push to, pay players more. There has been this kind of crazy inflation that's been going on in the NBA around salaries that I think was a real big push by the players as well. It was almost like a concession to that dynamic. And, when it comes to the political activity of NBA players, it's, you definitely see that there are NBA players who definitely have their perspective, but you can see how much the media has so much control, especially the corporate media in particular, so much control over what NBA players can and are willing to say. As much as I've supported LeBron James in the past, he's been attacked, especially for his stance on China, which wasn't really a stance at all, but he was attacked for it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can tell that LeBron James, because of the corporate media's control over the players and what they're allowed to say, he picks very convenient issues to oppose and to talk about, especially around Trump, right? It's easy when the corporate media is on board with, going after Trump for, I guess, just about anything.
And police brutality.
Exactly. And police brutality. Yeah. And, we all remember when LeBron James said he didn't have enough information when Tamir Rice was killed.
In his backyard.
Exactly. So that the media has such a stranglehold over the narrative, and such a stranglehold over the narrative that, as we remember, people like Allen Iverson were demonized for the way that they treated the media, right? That was really what it was about. It wasn't about practice. It wasn't about anything like that. It was because he went to the media and didn't give them the answers that they wanted. They weren't clean cut. This is actually in the contracts of the players union that they negotiate, the NBA mandates that, just like every sports league mandates, that you talk to the media and you act like this and you make sure that you answer questions. That's why whenever you listen to sports players, you really don't want to listen to them, because they say the same things, right? We played a good game, we worked hard, all that nonsense. But when it comes to these moments where there is an uprising, where there is a larger movement, it's just so obvious that this venue, that this arena of organized sports, because it's so corporate controlled at the top, it has become more and more difficult for people like LeBron James and other players to kind of go the way of, let's say, a Paul Robeson, who we talked about in our book, right? Paul Robeson basically gave up his career. He was a wildly successful, talented actor, singer, and he basically athlete, exactly. He was the whole 9 yards when it comes to entertainment, and he basically gave up his career for his principles, for standing up to anti-communism, to lynching, to Jim Crow, and all of that together basically bankrupted him. But at the same time, it was a different period back then. The industry that he was in did not have the same influence at the top as it does now, right? You had a lot of celebrities, a lot of athletes, a lot of actors back in that period, in the early to mid 20th century, actually taking these stands and being a big part of the movement against racism, the movement against Jim Crow, and the movement against nuclear weapons and the Cold War, etc. But now,
U.S. hegemony in general, with people like Muhammad Ali. Yeah,
exactly. And now you have a situation where celebrities, yes, they kind of act as conduits of American exceptionalism, and they act as the measure of how strong that ideology is really among the people, because athletes, unfortunately, And I think that this is a mistake. And I think it's a mistake that celebrities have such an influence over politics, but they tend to be the political representatives of the people. And I think this whole NBA cares and all of that is a part of this. It's a part of, right, building that relationship between sporting institutions, the powers that be, and the people.
Do you think, to your point about LeBron James, do you think that Michael Jordan might have been the birth of the corporate athlete? I mean, they had that 11-part series on his final season with the Bulls. Was the Bulls' final championship season? Do you feel like he's kind of without Michael Jordan, you don't get LeBron James? Like, I feel like LeBron James is almost a more polished Michael Jordan in the sense of all the things that Jordan got criticized for, LeBron does on some level. Like just enough.
Right. Well, definitely Michael Jordan is the highest stage of that athlete. It was definitely building, especially in the period beginning, during the Reagan years, this whole neoliberal period. The corporate athlete was becoming more and more of an attractive investment. And Michael Jordan was the highest stage. He was this incredible athlete that really I don't think any of these owners or anyone had seen before, right? Someone with this kind of talent that could produce these results. And not to mention, he did come from a very conservative black middle class background. I mean, that helped a lot. And I watched The Last Dance. I wrote an article about it, and it's obvious that that was his background. And it was such his background that he was more conservative than even his parents, as his mother supporting a black politician in South Carolina, and he refused to support that politician based on the fact that Republicans buy shoes too, and lo and behold, that helped. That helped a little bit, and at least to a certain degree, elect a segregationist into office there. So I think Michael Jordan, definitely in just his manner, in the ways in which he was so willing to collaborate with the establishment, with the owners. There was this whole thing in The Last Dance I found so interesting that the general manager of the Bulls was made into the big villain, right? And you think it's almost like this labor management dispute. But when you think about it, it was actually about Michael Jordan collaborating with the owner, with the coach, who honestly, Phil Jackson had more stature than the general manager at that time, collaborating with actually the most powerful forces to basically just influence business decisions. And that was the basis of the entire conflict. Really, it's not a progressive one. It was not at all. It's like, wow, this is such a public relations ploy to make it look like Michael Jordan at some point was some sort of victim. And, it was trying to create this victim narrative almost, because I think there was probably some conversations during the making of the film about how Michael Jordan just didn't come off as a very likable guy. And this was the way to make him likable, by creating a villain that was more villainous than him. But what's so interesting about that is I think Michael Jordan was more than just an athlete. He became almost like the surrogate boss of this whole corporate athlete phenomenon, that he was able to build this sort of corporate empire that allowed him to not only generate all of this wealth for himself, but also create a model for what it looks like to be a collaborationist, to be someone who basically plays the game and doesn't get out of turn or speak out of turn or take a stance on issues that will basically at some level threaten the bottom line of the profit system. And I always believe the most interesting part of Michael Jordan's career was when he basically acted as a scab against Craig Hodges to stop the boycott of the NBA Finals during the Rodney King riot, or the Rodney King rebellion, I should say. And that in and of itself never, I mean, it wasn't in The Last Dance. It barely ever gets talked about. But the fact that he did that just shows what kind of model Michael Jordan was really presenting. It wasn't about hard work and diligence and all that. I think a lot of kids and everything get that side of the story, right? He worked hard, he worked at it, he did all the right things. I played basketball in high school. That's all I ever heard. Oh, you work hard, you do the right things, you're gonna succeed. And that's what you get. That's the American dream ideal. But what you have to sacrifice in order to achieve that is usually very political in character.
It's interesting that you say that. A good friend of mine is the coach at Oakland High, and he coached Damian Lillard, if you follow basketball. And we had a show talking about the gentrification of high school sports. Because now that whole you work hard is really different because there's so many training facilities. And now we're starting to see the NBA start to get overtaken by a different type of athlete. The days of the Ron Artest are kind of waning as we see, like here in Oakland, the Steph Currys and the Klay Thompsons, the children of athletes. Even if their dads didn't play in the NBA, their dads might have played in Europe or big time D1 colleges. So that's I love that. Also in your book, you guys attack Captain America.
Yep, we don't pull any punches.
How can you attack the first Avenger?
Well, what's really interesting about Captain America's story is that it represents this representation of the United States as the principal force that defeated fascism, right? That's the story of the comic book that eventually it was taken by probably the whitest actor that you could find in Chris Evans. But Captain America, what's so interesting, and I really do credit Roberto for finding some of these amazing sources that made this very profound analysis of Captain America as, his shield, kind of representing this idea that the United States only acts out of defense, right? That's his only weapon, is the shield, and to protect himself, to protect others. And it was a very powerful statement in my eyes because, we talk a lot about in the book this period from World War II onward, where the United States argued that it was the principal force of democracy, a benevolent empire, the most ardent force against fascism during World War II and afterwards. And it's such a pernicious myth that even many anti-war activists and just activists in general will argue this, even if they say, oh, well, Iraq, Afghanistan was bad. These interventions of recent years have been just not in our interests. But remember World War II, right? You'll have a lot of people who talk about it like that. But Captain America almost signifies how that myth has been so deeply embedded in the U.S. story, how you don't get the real side of the United States' role in World War II. You don't get the story of the United States actually allowing a lot of Nazi scientists, spies to come to the United States and seek refuge because, of course, the United States' main goal was to undermine the Soviet Union, and it believed that if it could get the principal forces on its side that were trying to destroy the Soviet Union during World War II, that would be beneficial to U.S. foreign policy objectives. You don't get the side of the United States as actually being a very deliberate force in trying to become what it eventually became, which was the number one superpower in the world during the war. You don't get that side of the story. You don't get the sitting back while Europe was getting pummeled, while the Soviet Union was getting pummeled by Nazi Germany. You don't get the story of how long the U.S. waited to allow Pearl Harbor to occur so it could justify its entrance in the war. You don't get these kind of stories. You don't get the story of the nuclear warheads that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima did not have to be dropped at all, because Japan was already in a position of surrender, that the Soviet Union was marching to Manchuria to basically force that surrender, and that the reason why the nuclear weapons were dropped was a show of force against them. You don't hear about Dresden, Germany, where at least 100,000 people were killed by U.S. and U.K. firebombing while the Red Army was marching toward that city. You know, you don't hear this. You don't hear about the U.S. sponsorship of Hitler's political rise through its multinational corporations before its entrance into the war, because many big industrialists and capitalists like Henry Ford believed Hitler to be a very convenient partner in the broader coming war, which was always on the horizon and always seen as sort of the next stage of the U.S.'s journey towards predominance and empire, of trying to undermine and overthrow the Soviet Union. So you don't hear these things. And then you have someone like Captain America, a hero who is basically his main mission, which, you know, isn't accurate in history, but it is a very nice story, that he is mainly opposed to fascism, and that's what he looks for and what he fights against in all of his in all of his endeavors. So we attack Captain America mainly because we find that narrative to be just so inaccurate and so divorced from what we really need to know about how the United States has behaved over the course of its history, so we can have a more accurate picture of what the United States is all about.
Mm-hmm. Are you a fan of the Avengers movies at all?
I am. I've seen them all. I mean, they're it's funny because they're not particularly good movies, I wouldn't say, but they have this entertainment value to them, and that's what also makes the quote unquote propaganda. I don't even like using the word propaganda, but it makes the misinformation and the narrative, the imperial narrative, so attractive, because they are well done. They do represent this sort of Hollywoodism that is important to this ideology, that these films promote this message, and even try in this period where there aren't many people beyond, at least in terms of the fan base of the Avengers, who are rah America, but there is, you have this huge Black Panther fan base. You have a huge fan base that is looking for something a little more nuanced, and watching Avengers try to do that while at the same time stay true to what its corporate masters want, which is a narrative that worships militarism, Tony Stark, etc.
Tony Stark, yeah.
That's always very interesting to watch. It's almost, it's a real study in the way that liberalism in the United States is really the ideological force of capitalism and imperialism, because it is what kind of determines the narrative. It's not, the Klan, the political right, the ultra right. They definitely have a huge say in how the narrative is determined, but it's honestly, and this is why we wrote the book, we have to understand that the capitalist class, the corporate masters at the top, they are the ones who determine, from the say of all of the different forces and the input of all the different forces on the ground, exactly what kind of narrative we hear, what kind of information we're given, and that's a really important thing to note, because I think a lot of people believe American exceptionalism is almost like this consensual agreement. It's a consensus among all Americans here that even if things get really bad, that somehow we're no worse off than anyone else around the world, that we may be actually slightly better off than many other places around the world. And that kind of attitude is probably the most dangerous, because it doesn't take into account just how relationships of power is what is driving this ideology, and that these relationships of power are actually what is making us believe that this is some sort of consensus agreement among Americans, when actually as we've seen with the uprisings, the pandemic, etc., there is a lot of dismay and anger here in the United States around the way things work. And then around the world, the story is even more, I think, interesting in the sense that most of the world sees the U.S. as a force for war and a huge threat to peace and human life itself. So it's just as things get worse in the United States, it appears that this ideology becomes even more pernicious, even more desperate in the sense that its rulers and its creators and its distributors are themselves much more desperate to maintain grip on power as things become more and more unstable.
Speaking of instability, in the age of COVID-19, that has really hit the U.S. pretty hard, of course, with especially where you are in the East Coast, with a strikingly high death toll, also the economic toll it's taking. Recently, Donald Trump had a rally in, I think it was Tulsa, where he made some jokes about calling COVID-19 the Wuhan virus again. Is this a way for him to kind of deflect? I know it's definitely a way for him to deflect from his flaws, but in a grander scheme, is this a way to deflect away from the myth of American exceptionalism? Because we've kind of been exposed, if you will, with COVID-19.
Yeah. Racism and this anti-China racism in particular that's grown immensely during the destructive impact of COVID-19 here in the United States is definitely at its base a way for the ruling class as a whole to deflect from the just outright miserable conditions that this pandemic has exposed here. And then for Trump, of course, it's largely political and electoral too, because his base and a growing segment of the U.S. population, not just his base. I think people have this very misconstrued when you have over 50% of people who believe China should pay reparations to the U.S. and the world for COVID-19, when you have over 60% of people in the United States with a negative view of China, you have a situation where you have a majority opinion about the dangers of the so-called red menace and the yellow menace over, across the world. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in. And, it's not every day that you have a singular event kind of exposing all of the fissures with American exceptionalism at one time. You had the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black people, which just exposed how racist the U.S. society really is and how Black America as a whole is just not in the position that American exceptionalism and this meritocratic progress myth claims of them to be in. It claims them to be in a far better position than they were prior to the civil rights movement. And what we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic is actually most Black people are living in impoverished conditions, working low-wage jobs that employers do not provide protections for. They had to be out there. They live in substandard housing conditions, often living with 3, 4, 5, 6 people in one dwelling, higher rates of homelessness. You can go down the line. The racist policing played a role in this pandemic too, with the mask usage, the profiling, as well as the fact that here in New York City, this was documented that, Black Americans, peoples of color, were a huge target of harassment and of punishment around so-called social distancing guidelines, while, of course, the white yuppies in the rich areas of the city were honestly the most egregious violators of the social distancing protocols, Jesus. But of course were not punished at all. So, you had all of these dynamics at play for Black people, which exposed the racist character of the system. And I believe that played a role in the ultimate rebellion that we have seen take place around George Floyd's murder. It was like George Floyd was a spark that lit a fire which had been building over the course of months, but of course centuries. And then you had the foreign policy aspect of it. The U.S. was leveling sanctions on Iran, it was threatening sanctions against China. It was saber rattling with China, sending warships to the South China Sea, all during a pandemic. It was building a military base in Syria. It was trying to assassinate Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela through botched charges around drug trafficking, ironically. And so you had all of these developments around the world that showed the U.S. to be an empire. It was not rolling back. For everything that had to pause, the U.S. military's adventures around the world to sustain and expand its empire were not curbed. And then you also had the economic aspect of this, the devastating impact that this pandemic had on workers, and the ways in which the U.S. capitalist economy is not meritocratic. It is unable to sustain human life. And we saw that with the ways in which this society, this neoliberal capitalist society, was unable to meet the challenge of addressing a pandemic, which has deadly consequences if it's allowed to run amok. And, we had China, we had other countries, Venezuela, we had Vietnam show the way of what a very positive pandemic response could look like. And the U.S. just doesn't have the infrastructure for that. It has a for-profit healthcare system. It has a very fragmented government system. It has a threadbare public system generally, social services system. It doesn't have supports for people. Most people don't own their homes. Most people are renting from real estate developers, big corporations. You had basically the gambit of people's lives being exposed in the United States as just one big profit mill for major corporations and banks, and that these major corporations and banks would rather people starve, die, and be plunged into a Great Depression because at the end of the day, for them, the reward is bigger than the risk. So it's not every day that you have this happen. And I think in a sense, of course, the pain is not positive, but it does leave us with a huge lesson to be learned, which I think can lead to positive developments for the struggle, against imperialism, against racism, and for, a new society that's more attendant to our needs.
How do we, and that seems to be the big issue. How do we move towards enlightening people to make that change when constantly the narrative is around, instead of things like to your point, the better handling that places like Vietnam or even Taiwan did in handling the virus. And it's always about kind of what Donald Trump said, the dumb things that he says, or Fauci's faces that he makes during a press conference, and not so much things like, well, states have to compete against each other now for protective equipment and testing, that also have to compete against countries driving up the prices for these very, very precious items. How do we kind of push that, get away from the kind of the silliness of the things that Trump does and the seriousness of what this administration is doing to really harm people domestically and abroad?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. A big factor will be in nurturing the uprising that's occurring now, being not only involved in it, but also raising demands, raising points of debate and discussion, which can help further the development of those activists to be able to take on further steps toward their demands, defund the police, abolish the police, really trying to define what that is, what that should mean, what that could mean if these ideas, these demands are allowed to be left in the abstract. And I think that's a huge step in this process. It's funny, there's a contradiction, I think, between the power of the corporate media and how the corporate media and the Democratic Party especially do have a stranglehold on progressive politics, the radical politics in the United States, have this uncanny ability to send movements to their graveyard. But at the same time, there's also a huge dislike of the corporate media, of course, which Trump took huge advantage of, and which I think most of, at least the quote unquote millennial generation, is mainly detached from, maybe paying attention to the narratives, but definitely not making corporate media consumption a big part of their day-to-day lives. And that leaves, I think, a vacuum which must be accompanied by the introduction of real independent media and real political education and organized political education. I think that the most committed revolutionaries I've ever met, and that I've worked with and met, and those that are doing the most critical work, tend to place an emphasis on organizing political education. And even though it doesn't look sexy, it doesn't bring immediate results, often it's this long game of developing leadership and organized leadership in the grassroots, which ultimately wins the struggle at the end of the day. We've seen this in revolutions in the past, that if we don't have an organized leadership, if we don't have, dare I say, a vanguard organization which can articulate not only the demands and the needs and the desires of masses of people, but also help them understand the essential character of this society, then ultimately we are going to continue to run into this political dead end of being channeled into acceptable directions through, whether it's nonprofits, through whether it's this Trumpism, everything's about Trump. It will be the DNC that plays that role, and we need to counter that at all costs. You know, at Black Agenda Report, we always talk about the Democratic Party as the principal force in the way of a real, true revolutionary moment here in the United States, that if we are able to get over that hump, it's not the Republicans, the white man's party, it's not them that will be stopping us, it will be the Democrats. And that's why we talk about the Democratic Party in our book as the engine of American exceptionalism, because American exceptionalism right now is the most powerful ideological weapon in protecting the interests of the ruling class as a whole. And the Democratic Party has taken it as its role to be the most malleable, the most professional, and the most how should I say, the most effective means of getting that ideology across to the forces that honestly matter the most, right? The white man's party and the Republican Party is for sure on the side of American exceptionalism. They promote it, but they promote it to their base, which is a mainly white base. It's a mainly wealthy base. It's a base that has long agreed upon this idea that the U.S. needs to be a white country, a whites only country. And the Democratic Party, though, has for decades held in captivity the labor movement, the Black political movement, and with that said, becomes a more dangerous force in a lot of ways. So I think that's one of the big targets right now for us and for me, and why we wrote this book, is the Democratic Party's stranglehold over the movement has to end. Even with the Sanders phenomenon, as encouraging as it was, and seeing a lot of young people embrace these demands, these social democratic demands, which could really make hay and cause a lot of havoc for the U.S. ruling class. And we saw that in 2020 and 2016. But at the end of the day, if it's confined within the Democratic Party, if there's still this underlying belief that the Democratic Party can reform, that the U.S. can be the society that ultimately offers what people need, that it's constructed in that way, then it's reinforcing American exceptionalism, this idea that, yeah, the U.S. can do this as it's currently constituted. And we ultimately see the results of that. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And it does create huge setbacks. I mean, I've been kind of just talking to myself about this and others when I get the chance, that when we see this uprising right now, it's pretty obvious that, yes, defund the police, abolish the police is in it. But even though you would think that there are a lot of people supportive of Bernie Sanders's campaigns in these movements, you don't really see the demands, and you don't see the political conversation occurring around these more economic and material demands to supplement and to complement it. It's not there. So obviously the setback of running within the Democratic Party has a huge part to play in that. This idea that the Democratic Party can be reformed, and the fact that once you engage with that, it has given the corporate media and the Black misleadership class and all of them the ability to kind of create this also mythical notion that, yeah, Bernie Sanders and the Medicare for all and all those things are just like white people things. And those aren't things that ultimately Black people are interested in. And so you have this, I think, dynamic where, yeah, you have a separation of what ultimately is very interconnected, right? These economic grievances with the grievances against the white supremacist state.
And that's kind of what I wanted to bring up when you say that, because I saw Brianna Joy Gray just get hammered whenever she went on quote unquote Black shows, like Karen Hunter's show, who I'm not really a fan of. And then you have kind of this Candace Owens Blexit thing, where it was the Black exit from the Democratic Party, get off the quote unquote plantation.
Right.
And I think that rhetoric really resonated with a lot of Black people that weren't part of the middle class, like that kind of bourgeoisie that co-opted the civil rights movement. And because of the two-party duopoly, it became this whole thing of, and I don't know if you have friends like this on your social media as well, but as we started pointing out the flaws of the Democratic Party, as it became more and more apparent, like you're saying, it's almost like it gave a voice to this pseudo movement to move away, not to third parties like the Green Party or the Socialist Party, but just to the Republican Party. Like, hey, the Republicans freed you with Abraham Lincoln, and the Democrats were Ku Klux Klan people. And I have to sit here and be like, okay, man, this is a long time ago. Are you really going to say that Ronald Reagan and Abraham Lincoln are the same guy? Come on.
Yeah. No. Oh God. Yeah. No. The Candace Owens phenomenon is equally infuriating because, yeah, there is this political vacuum right now. There is, I think, especially among younger Black voters, this, I think, desire to detach from the neoliberal establishment, and Candace Owens, I think, is kind of trying to pimp that reality, as well as the fact that the Democratic Party, because of just its general intransigence and stagnation, in the age of Trump, where Trump is getting all of the attention, all of the PR, all of the media attention, that has led to her making a very calculated business decision that this is very good for me. I will get this attention that I need. A lot of profits generated through the media now is through ratings, through, all of the various ways that folks get attention on social media and et cetera. So, it's so criminal in a ways because she intentionally distorts history to take advantage of this underlying resentment with the Democratic Party. I mean, the whole thing that you just said, what complete ahistorical garbage when it comes to the ways in which political parties have operated. Margaret Kimberley, as you interviewed her about her book, does a very good job of very succinctly stating that these political parties have undergone various changes depending on which political party calculated how to capture the black vote. I mean, that was in how to capture the vote that was sympathetic, for example, to abolition of slavery and whatnot. That a lot of black people's political activity independently ultimately influenced how political parties, the two political parties that we've ever had, change their dynamics. So yes, you can't compare the Republican Party of the Civil War period with the Republican Party of today, because a lot has happened since then to completely shift the dynamics, right? The Democratic Party now is in a situation where it tries to act like that party of Lincoln, but it cannot act like that party of Lincoln because, one, there is no black political movement on the ground, and two, the ruling class, the corporate donors, the black misleadership class, they're all working together to ensure that doesn't happen, right? So they have a vested interest in sort of keeping black people on the quote unquote plantation, but really what it is, they want to keep them in captivity so they can't be the leading revolutionary force in a progressive and left direction, not in the direction that Candace Owen wants, which is a completely sort of victim blame, outright racist. I mean, she's made so many outright racist. She's trying to bring people into the Trump camp because the Trump camp makes money for her. And it ultimately is just a huge act of opportunism. But it's only allowed by, honestly, it's only allowed by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party could end Candace Owens' career very easily by, let's say, not peddling a Joe Biden. It wouldn't be too difficult. Not peddling a Joe Biden, at least pandering to the needs of Black America. It hasn't even been doing that, especially over the course of this crisis. So yeah, Candace Owens has a lot to build upon. You know, I watched some weird forum. I don't know if I think it was on BET. I don't know, where she was talking with T.I. and Killer Mike, and of course none of them.
Yeah, it was
right.
Revolt.
Yeah, none of them was willing to challenge her on what, you know, they were willing to call. T.I. was willing to call her a white supremacist. Killer Mike was like trying to play peacemaker, but none of them really challenged her on the actual fact of how the Democratic Party is allowing people like her to exist. And that what's needed more so is an independent, you know, grassroots party that, you know, can actually, you know, speak to the interests of Black people and attempt to, you know, respect its leadership and build a new Black movement. I mean, there's just no engagement with history with any of these folks. So Candace Owens looks like she's some sort of respectable new phenomena that you got to listen to because we got to hear all the sides. But really, she is just, yeah, she's just a pimp of, you know, she's not even a poverty pimp. She's just a pimp of the Democratic Party's demise, I guess you could say.
Oh, yeah, maybe that's what she is. Maybe she is the end of the Democratic Party as we know it, which I wouldn't mind seeing. I recently had Angela Walker and Howie Hawkins on the show, and that's you know, Chris Hedges has a critique of Bernie Sanders in 2016 where he says that he should have tried to build a stronger third party. And I definitely have been thinking about that more and more and go, oh, well, maybe you should have. What do you think?
Well, if Bernie Sanders had the capacity to do so, then yes, I do believe that in 2016, when Jill Stein, even though this may have been to the chagrin of many Greens, when Jill Stein offered her seat, you know, her candidacy to him, if he had taken that, that would have been a monumental moment, of course. But of course, that wasn't going to happen because I think a lot of folks like Chris Hedges have a good sense that, yeah, he didn't want to end up like Ralph Nader. But they think at the base of that, even regardless of, you know, I think that's probably true. But what's more true is that he is much more indebted to the Democratic Party as a career politician than he is to the independent kind of upsurge that he probably unintentionally maybe generated through his candidacy. Didn't expect all the excitement, didn't expect to have a chance. And once he did, he wasn't prepared for that responsibility because, I mean, I'm a big reader of Lenin. Social democrats are just never really prepared for that kind of responsibility to be at the head of a movement. They're really about trying to ameliorate what already exists and to play a sort of, I don't even want to say reformist role, but to play the role of making the capitalist state, the imperialist state, the racist state more acceptable. And at the end of the day, depending on what period you're in, what conditions on the ground exist, what is the strength of the movement, all of those things come together to usually negate that or create setbacks even through the reforms that may take place, like as we've seen in U.S. history and the New Deal, the so-called Civil Rights period. All of those had great achievements, but also had great setbacks when it comes to the ways in which, exactly, redlining, but and the ways in which reforms take a lot of support away from radical and revolutionary organizations. I love the book Black Against Empire about the Black Panther Party because there is this very, I think, astute acknowledgement that it wasn't just the repression COINTELPRO that took the wind out of the sails of the Black Panther Party. It was also the fact that, yes, this Black misleadership class was cultivated to kind of create this illusion of Black progress and Black uplift and upward mobility. And there was also the fact that, even though the Black Panther Party arose out of the limitations of civil rights reforms, it also had to contend with how those reforms changed political dynamics on the ground nationwide, not just with Black people, but with all people, right? With working people, this idea that, this progress was occurring. So now you're going to tell me we need a revolution? Like there is reality to that, especially when you see that the impetus for more revolutionary activity among non-Black members of this society was really about the Vietnam War. And once the draft was ended, there was much less attachment to Marxist ideology, revolutionary ideology, than there was before. So I think reforms, play this role. And American exceptionalism is the backdrop of reform, really. It's this idea that once people have their say and they get in the struggle and they fight and they win something, concessions from the ruling class, then things are generally okay. And then you can sit back and read back about how Martin Luther King had a dream, and that dream has been fulfilled through Obama, and we're in
and Oprah,
and Oprah, and we're in this place of equality, or at least if we're not in a place of equality, we're in a place that's much better than in years past, and we don't have to have this sense of urgency. And we also can kind of appreciate what already exists. And that appreciation, that loyalty helps build support for the counterinsurgency that we see against social movements that has occurred, especially in the last 10 years. First, Occupy was crushed, then Ferguson was crushed. Now we're seeing this recent iteration of the movement for Black Lives that is covertly right now being attacked in so many ways by the cops, by intelligence. We see the lynchings happening, across the country. All of that is part of this counterinsurgency war that is inevitable always whenever there's an uprising led by Black people. And we're also seeing how the ruling class, the kente cloth kneeling, all of that is trying to capture the moment and show. And of course, they've gotten some of George Floyd's family in on the mix, right? Like there is this attempt that always occurs. It's almost like clockwork, right? You had the same thing with some of Michael Brown's family. They always get some members of the Trayvon Martin's family that will be kind of like the spokespeople of why we just need to vote and everything will be fine. And then you have, the politicians trying to peddle reforms that aren't actually adequate. It's almost like a recycling of history. And yeah, the American exceptionalist ideology is kind of the foundations to that help make it legitimate again and again and again. And so challenging it is so important.
Well, I know you are a busy person, and I appreciate you taking the time out to talk to me today. Um, I definitely wish we had way more time because there's
Right. There's so much I know. You can never get to all of it.
there's so much I want to talk to you about. So I will extend the invitation
Yeah, let's do
for
it
you to
again.
come back so we can do it again one of these days. Is there anything you want to promote?
Yeah, follow us at blackagendareport.com each week, original content. Margaret Kimberley and I have recently started a YouTube program, which we'll be doing every couple of weeks or so. At least we're trying to do twice a month. It's tough to write weekly, do twice a month work. So twice a month, called Black Agenda Report Presents the Left Lens. And you can find that on Black Agenda Report's website as well. And yeah, we talked a little bit about the pandemic. I do have an article on International Critical Thought, a journal based in China, but it's an international journal about COVID-19, American exceptionalism in the age of COVID-19, the great unmasking. So check that out online. And just follow me on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, Spirit of HO.
I'm going to have links to all that in the description on the show. Thank you so much again for your time. If you guys can, go get Daniel's book, American Exceptionalism. American. Oh, God, what is the title? It's so long.
I know, it is really long. American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror.
There you go.
Yeah, I forgot it too. I forgot it too in the beginning. When the book was first released, I would always be like, "What's the title again?" Because there were a lot of title changes too. So anyway, not long story short, yeah, I forgot it too a lot in the beginning.
Real quick, what was your first idea for the title?
Oh man, I think it was American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. It had something to do with white supremacy in Wall Street, like
Ooh.
yeah, it just the publisher didn't really want that, but I forget. It had something to do with American exceptionalism and American innocence, something like a tool of white supremacy in Wall Street, or the ideological power of Wall Street and white supremacy, something like that. But it had something to do with that. I can't remember it now. It was so long ago. This was like 2009. This was like 2019 or like 2018, 19 early. So I'm blanking.
Oh, well, time is moving real slow right now in the age of shelter in place. So
yeah, for sure.
Days or months. But hold on, Danny, don't hang up. I'm going to play some music. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.